You know, there are invisible lines we draw in our lives, boundaries that define our character, our patience, and ultimately, what we're willing to die for. For Elias, Pop Sterling, a man who had seen 78 winters come and go, that line wasn't some abstract philosophical concept. It was the concrete edge of his front porch. For 3 decades, his morning ritual was as reliable as the sunrise itself. He'd brew a pot of dark roast coffee, the kind that smells like burnt earth and comfort, step out into the cool air, and meticulously raise the stars and stripes on the pole by his front door. This wasn't just habit. It was a liturgy, a silent conversation with the ghosts of the friends he lost overseas and the wife he buried 2 years ago, a way of saying, I am still here, and this ground matters. But the neighborhood of Whispering Pines wasn't the sanctuary it used to be. Slowly, insidiously, the charm of the mismatched family homes had been eroded, swallowed whole by a corporate entity known as Apex Horizon Management. It was run by a man named Julian Voss, a guy who looked at a neighborhood and didn't see families or memories. He saw a spreadsheet where Pop Sterling was just a red error code that needed deleting. Voss was turning the entire area into a sterile, beige dystopia of identical lawns and draconian rules, and Pop was the last holdout, the one stubborn nail that refused to be hammered down by the checkbook or the threat. Pop had ignored the letters, tossed the buyout offers into the fireplace, and politely closed the door on the slick real estate agents. But that morning, the coffee tasted bitter because the game changed. A matte black SUV, looking like a shark moving through calm water, glided up to the curb, its windows tinted so dark they seemed to absorb the light. 2 men stepped out, and let me tell you, these weren't your typical HOA representatives with clipboards and complaints about grass height. Kruger was the talker, a man wearing a suit that cost more than Pop's car but fit him like a shroud, and Bane, a silent slab of muscle whose eyes looked dead to the world. Pop watched them from the porch, his hand resting on the railing, his spine straightening with that reflexive discipline only a retired Marine possesses. Mr. Sterling, Kruger called out, his voice dripping with a synthetic warmth that made your skin crawl. Beautiful morning to make the right decision, don't you think? Pop didn't smile, didn't blink, he just said, I'm not selling. I told Voss. I told his lawyers. And now I'm telling you, get off my property. The fake smile on Kruger's face vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, predatory stare. He took a step onto the porch, violating that invisible line Pop had drawn. See, that's the problem, old-timer. Kruger sneered, closing the distance. This isn't a negotiation anymore. Mr. Voss is finishing his project, and you are the only thing standing in the way of progress. Pop squared his shoulders, looking 10 years younger, ready to defend his castle. Some ground you don't give up, he said, his voice flat and hard as iron. That was the trigger. Kruger nodded to Bane, and in a blur of motion that no 78-year-old should ever have to process, the violence exploded. Kruger grabbed Pop's left arm, twisting it with a mechanic's precision, while Bane blocked the old man's retreat, effectively pinning him against the railing. Pop struggled, his instincts screaming fight, but age is a cruel thief, and strength isn't what it used to be. There was a sound, a wet, sickening snap that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet cul-de-sac, followed by a gasp of pure, white-hot agony. Pop collapsed, his knees hitting the concrete, his left arm hanging at a grotesque angle, completely shattered. Through the haze of pain that was graying out his vision, he looked up at Kruger, who was casually brushing a speck of dust off his lapel, looking at Pop like he was nothing more than roadkill. Mr. Voss, Kruger said, his voice devoid of humanity, doesn't like hearing the word no. They turned, got back into the Black Shark, and drove away, leaving a decorated war veteran writhing on his own porch beneath the flag he'd just raised. But here is where Julian Voss made his fatal miscalculation, because Pop wasn't entirely alone. Across the street, peeking through the blinds with trembling hands, was Mrs. Higgins, a widow who usually spent her days knitting and watching game shows. She had seen the SUV, she had felt the wrongness of it, and she had pressed record on her iPhone. She captured every second of it, the threat, the grab, the snap, the smirk. Shaking, terrified that they might come back, she dialed 911, but as the operator picked up, Mrs. Higgins realized something terrifying. The police would file a report, Maybe arrest the thugs if they could find them, but men like Voss? They don't fear the law because they usually own it. She hung up and dialed a number Pop's late wife had given her on a scrap of paper years ago, labeled simply, "In case of fire or hell." 200 miles away, inside a garage that smelled of grease, gasoline, and impending violence, Jax Sterling answered the phone. Jax was Pop's grandson, an ex-Army Ranger who had traded his fatigues for a leather cut and a Harley. He was deep into a transmission rebuild, his knuckles scarred and greasy, when he heard Mrs. Higgins' weeping voice recounting the horror. He didn't scream. He didn't throw his wrench. He went deadly, unnervingly still. "Did you get the video?" Jax asked, his voice dropping an octave, a low rumble like a storm on the horizon. "Send it to me. Lock your doors, and stay away from the windows. Mrs. Higgins, you did good." He hung up and stood there for a long minute, staring at a calendar on the wall with a picture of him and Pop fishing, remembering the man who taught him how to be decent, how to be strong. The rage that filled him wasn't hot. It was absolute zero, a cold, calculating fury that clarified the world into targets and objectives. Jax pulled out his phone and opened an encrypted messaging app, typing a single code into a group chat called the Steel Vipers. Code Black. Whispering Pines. Grandfather down. Silent Protocol. Within seconds, the acknowledgments rolled in. From a high-rise law firm in the city, a man named Gavel closed his laptop, straightened his tie, and walked out of a meeting worth millions. From a basement lit only by server racks, a hacker known as Cypher cracked his knuckles and logged into a network he wasn't supposed to exist in. And from a construction site, a behemoth of a human being named Titan dropped a sledgehammer, wiped the sweat from his brow, and walked off the job without a word. The cavalry was coming, but they weren't bringing horses, they were bringing iron, and Julian Voss had no idea he had just declared war on the wrong family. An hour later, the atmosphere in Whispering Pines shifted, the air growing heavy with the deep, rhythmic thrum of V-twin engines. It wasn't the chaotic, ear-splitting noise of a joyriding gang. It was a disciplined, menacing rumble, like a battalion of tanks rolling into position. 12 motorcycles, led by Jax on his matte black cruiser, swept through the manicured entrance of the neighborhood. They moved in perfect formation, faces hidden behind dark visors, wearing leather cuts emblazoned with a silver cobra coiled around a dagger, the sigil of the Steel Vipers. They didn't speed, they didn't shout, they just occupied the space. Titan parked his massive frame at the entrance of the cul-de-sac, crossing his arms like a guardian statue. Gavel and Jax rode straight to Pop's driveway, while others fanned out, parking strategically at every exit point of the neighborhood. It was a visual message broadcast in 4K resolution. This territory is under new management. High up in his glass-walled office downtown, Julian Voss watched a live feed from the security cameras he'd installed on the streetlights. He swirled a glass of aged scotch, chuckling as he watched the bikers dismount. "Look at them," he sneered to his assistant. "A bunch of Halloween cosplayers thinking they can scare me." He thought he was untouchable, insulated by layers of shell companies and high-priced attorneys. He thought this was a brute force confrontation. He was wrong. Jax walked into Pop's living room, where the old man was sitting in his recliner, his arm encased in a fresh plaster cast, his face pale, but his eyes burning with defiance. Jax knelt beside him, the leather of his vest creaking, and gently placed a hand on Pop's good shoulder. "The boys are here, Pop," Jax said softly. "This ain't a bar fight, son," Pop rasped, pain etching lines around his mouth. "Voss fights with money and lawyers, not fists." "I know," Jax replied, a dangerous glint in his eye. "And that's exactly how we're going to bury him." In the kitchen, the Vipers turned the dining table into a war room. Gavel, who was actually a disbarred prosecutor turned legal consultant for the club, spread out the Apex Horizon bylaws. Cypher set up a portable server rig that looked like something out of a sci-fi movie. Titan stood by the window, watching the street. "Here's the play," Jax commanded. "Voss expects us to break windows and bust heads, which gives him the excuse to call the cops and sweep us out. We give him nothing. We give him silence. Gavel, find the loophole. Cypher, follow the money. Titan, you and I are going to win the hearts and minds." For the next 6 hours, they waged a silent war. Cypher breached Apex Horizon's internal network, not by brute force, but by phishing a low-level secretary's credentials. He slipped into the digital bloodstream of the company, watching the financial flow. And there it was, a series of payments from the HOA's maintenance fund, laundered through 3 shell companies, landing directly in the bank accounts of a private security firm employing Kruger and Bain. But he found something even better, an email from Voss sent the night before. Subject: the Sterling problem. Body: make him an example. Break him if you have to. Just get it done. Meanwhile, gavel struck gold on page 300 of the HOA covenants. Got him, he whispered. Section 14, paragraph B. An emergency vote of no confidence can dissolve the board and the management contract immediately if signed by 60% of the homeowners. Voss wrote this to oust the previous board, but he never removed the clause. Jax and Titan hit the streets. They went door to door, not as bikers, but as neighbors. They showed the residents the video Mrs. Higgins took. They showed the terrifying reality of what Voss was doing. The fear that Voss had cultivated, the fear of fines, of lawsuits, of eviction, began to crack when faced with the image of a 78-year-old war hero with a shattered arm. The petition filled up. Name after name. A terrified young couple signed. The guy who was fined for having the wrong color mulch signed. Even the skeptical neighborhood watch captain signed. They had the numbers. Voss, realizing the tide was turning as his spies reported the petition, panicked. The cool corporate mask slipped. He called Kruger. The old lady. He barked into the phone, sweat beading on his forehead. Mrs. Higgins. She has the original video. Get her phone. Destroy it. Now. Boss, the bikers are everywhere. Kruger hesitated. I don't pay you to make excuses. I pay you to fix problems. Voss screamed. Mrs. Higgins was driving home from the pharmacy, feeling a mix of adrenaline and terror when she saw the black SUV in her rearview mirror. It was hunting her. She floored her sedan, her heart hammering against her ribs, but the SUV was faster, heavier. It pulled alongside her, swerving to run her off the road. She screamed, closing her eyes, bracing for the impact, but the impact never came. Instead, a roar like a splitting sky erupted. Titan had been watching. He launched his massive touring bike off the curb, accelerating with impossible speed. He pulled his motorcycle directly between Mrs. Higgins' car and the SUV, using his own body and machine as a shield. The metal of the SUV ground against the crash bars of the Harley, sparks showering the asphalt like fireworks. Titan didn't flinch. He leaned into the SUV, his sheer mass and leverage forcing the heavier vehicle away from the terrified widow. Suddenly, Jax and 2 other Vipers appeared from the side streets, boxing the SUV in. It was a masterclass in vehicular herding. They forced Kruger and Bain into a dead-end alley behind the community center. The thugs jumped out, ready to fight, but stopped dead. They were staring at 5 members of the Steel Vipers, helmets off, knuckles cracking. Titan stepped forward, his shadow engulfing them. He didn't raise a fist. He just smiled, a cold, terrifying expression. You boys seem lost, Titan rumbled. Kruger and Bain, realizing they had brought attitude to an army fight, scrambled back into their SUV, reversed aggressively, and fled, leaving their dignity and their mission in the dust. Jax watched them go, his phone buzzing. It was Cypher. I got everything, Cypher said. The money, the email, and the audio. Audio? Jax asked. Yeah. Voss records his own calls for quality assurance. I just downloaded him ordering the hit on the old lady. Jax looked at the community center building looming nearby. It's showtime. The Whispering Pines Community Center was usually a place for boring budget meetings and complaints about garbage bins. But tonight, the air was electric, thick with a tension you could taste. Every chair was taken, residents standing shoulder to shoulder along the walls. Mrs. Higgins sat in the front row, looking like a queen, flanked by Titan and Gavel. At 7 p.m. sharp, Julian Voss burst through the double doors, flanked by a phalanx of lawyers. He strode to the podium, looking immaculate, though his eyes darted around the room with the nervous energy of a trapped rat. He grabbed the microphone, his voice booming with false bravado. This meeting is unauthorized, Voss shouted, pointing a manicured finger at the crowd. Under the bylaws of Apex Horizon, any gathering not sanctioned by the board is illegal. I am ordering you all to disperse immediately or face legal action. The room went deadly silent. Then, Jack stepped out from the shadows of the stage wings. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing his cut, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. He walked right up to Voss, looking him in the eye, and gently took the microphone from the man's hand. Voss was too stunned to resist. "Mr. Voss," Jack said, his voice calm, amplified through the speakers. "We're not here to debate bylaws. We're here to watch a movie." Jax clicked a remote. A massive projector screen descended behind them. First came the video. The room gasped as they saw the high-definition footage of Pop's arm snapping. Sobs broke out. Voss turned pale, shouting at his lawyers to stop this, but Titan merely stepped in the path of the attorneys, crossing his arms. "Sit down," he rumbled. They sat. Then came the spreadsheets. Complex flows of money, simplified into undeniable graphics, showing residents' dues flowing directly into the pockets of the hired thugs. "You paid for your own assault," Jax told the crowd. "Your HOA fees funded the men who broke my grandfather's arm." "Lies. Fabrications," Voss screamed, sweat now pouring down his face. "You have no proof I ordered anything." "Funny you should say that," Jack said, clicking the remote one last time. The audio played. It was crystal clear. Voss's voice filled the hall. "I don't care about the old woman. Run her off the road if you have to. Just get that phone. Bury the report. I own the police chief in this district." The silence that followed was heavy, final. It was the sound of a guillotine blade hanging in the air. Voss stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He looked at the crowd and saw only hatred. He looked for an exit, but the doors opened again. This time, it wasn't bikers. It was the state police. City cops might have been on the payroll, but Gavel had sent the evidence to the state attorney general. Four troopers marched in, their faces grim. "Julian Voss," the lead trooper announced, his voice carrying to the back of the room. "You are under arrest for racketeering, conspiracy to commit assault, and wire fraud." The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut was louder than any motorcycle engine. As they dragged a kicking and screaming Voss out of the hall, Jax looked down at Pop, who was standing in the back, supported by a cane. Pop nodded, a single tear tracing a path through the wrinkles on his cheek. It wasn't a celebration of violence. It was the heavy, satisfying thud of justice. 2 weeks later, the vibe in Whispering Pines was unrecognizable. The for sale signs were gone. Apex Horizon was dissolved, its assets frozen. The neighbors held a block party that stretched for 3 streets. There was music, the smell of barbecue, and the sound of kids laughing, a sound that had been missing for years. Pop sat on his porch in a lawn chair, his cast covered in drawings from the neighborhood kids. Jack sat on the railing, nursing a cold beer. "You know," Pop said, watching the sunset paint the sky purple, "I spent my whole life fighting for this country. I thought the war was over a long time ago, but I guess you always have to keep watch." Jax took a sip, looking at the peace they had bought with intelligence and brotherhood. "The war changes, Pop. The enemy just wears better suits now." The steel Vipers mounted up as the sun dipped below the horizon. They didn't rev their engines to show off. They just rumbled away, fading into the twilight like ghosts who had finished their business. They left behind a neighborhood that wasn't just a collection of houses anymore, but a fortress of community. And that brings us to the end, but it leaves a question that keeps me up at night. We all love a story where the bully gets punched in the mouth, where the bikers ride in and save the day. But what happens if Mrs. Higgins hadn't looked out the window? What happens if Pop didn't have a grandson with a specialized skill set? In a world where corporations can by the law and silence the weak, is justice something that is given to us by the system, or is it something we have to take for ourselves, by any means necessary? Let me know what you think in the comments. And remember, keep your eyes open, because sometimes the line in the sand is right on your front porch.